Okay, welcome to our final chapter, the Civil War. We're going to have to race through this. Unfortunately, our timing was a little bit off. We spent a little bit too much time on certain sections, but that's okay. I'm going to do my best to give you an in-depth run through the Civil War so that you understand things from start to finish. So let's recap first of all where we have been going this whole entire week with Chapter 15, Road to the Civil War. Remember that in 1850, the Compromise of 1850 took place, making California a free state, and as a result of that, in order to get it to happen, the South needed to have something, and they had the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, requiring all Northerners to help get runaway slaves back into the South. The next thing, in 1854, we had the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This allowed people in the territory to use popular sovereignty, in other words, to vote if they wanted slavery or not. This kind of went against the Missouri Compromise, which said anything above 3630 should be free, anything below could be open to slavery. That was 1854. All these things have been kind of building up to cause battle. Just had a kid walk in, turning in some late work. Yay! All right, back to this. Popular sovereignty, people got to vote if they wanted slavery or not in Kansas, Nebraska, 1854, and I was saying how these events have caused the Civil War to kind of build up in people's minds and the South to want to break away and secede. Bleeding Kansas comes out of popular sovereignty. We talked about the voting that took place there, right? 6,000 votes were cast, 4,500 of them were from people in Missouri, the next door state. Only 1,500 people from Kansas actually voted in that. They put in a pro-slavery legislature, and that just caused problems. We even had John Brown and his sons retaliating against a pro-slavery city, killing 5 people at Pottawatomie Creek in retaliation for a pro-slavery group attacking the town of Lawrence, Kansas, which was anti-slavery. All right? That went on for about 2 years. We had the Dred Scott case. That happened in 1857. Remember, Dred Scott was a slave. He moved to Illinois and in Wisconsin, and he figured he could sue for his freedom after his owner's death. There were 4 main things that were determined in that case. Don't forget them. They're very important. Number 1 was that Dred Scott was still a slave. The second one was that Kansas government or Congress had no right to take property away from people, and that slavery cannot be prohibited in any territory. This made the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. Don't forget that. All right. Struggling here to get this off. Let's see if this works. No. Fantastic. Well, all right, let's pull it down. After the Dred Scott case, another thing that caused the Civil War to happen was Harper's Ferry. Remember, John Brown wanted to create a slave rebellion. So what he did was he attacked that arsenal, that federal arsenal in Virginia, and it was a big failure. He was turned into a martyr for the North, somebody that they respected and kind of thought about every time that they were talking about slavery. The South saw it as a conspiracy and an act of terror against slavery itself. So the South moves closer towards wanting to go to battle with the North at that point for sure. The election of 1860 did not help matters either. We had 3 Democrats, remember, run against the 1 Republican. Actually, it was 2 Democrats, 1 Constitutional Party guy who didn't really have a view on slavery, and then the Republican Party. Remember, the South thought of them as the black Republicans because they were supporting the black cause and slavery, anti-slavery ideas. So Lincoln wins the election by a majority there. He only had 40%, but he wins, and the South has none of that. So South Carolina secedes even before he's elected president, but after they find out the result. As soon as Lincoln takes office, we have other states joining South Carolina. Don't forget there that we had states like Texas and Florida and Georgia and North Carolina, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi all joined. Finally, we had the attack on Fort Sumter itself happening in 1860, and that really was the start of it, right? The Confederates fired first on the Union fort. All right, that brings us up to date. The war has begun. Lincoln calls for 75,000 troops, and the South has more states join the Union, join the Confederacy. We have Virginia, we have Arkansas, and the other two would be Tennessee and North Carolina. They would also join. All right, this is going to be the Civil War begins. We're going to talk about strategies used by both sides. We'll talk about important leaders, this key term called border states. We'll get down to military technology. There'll be a stopping point here. You'll have to stop and watch a video I posted on Schoology. And then we'll talk about one of the first battles, which was the Battle of Bull Run and Antietam down here to get you started. Then we'll talk about Gettysburg quickly, and we'll wrap up the Civil War with Appomattox Courthouse, where Lee surrenders finally. So here we go. Get ready to fill this out. It does not look the same as it does on the presentation I'm showing you here. So let's get started with border states. All right. So at this point, we have 24 U.S. Union states from the north, and we have 11 Confederate states. Okay. Border states, what are they? You're going to have to squeeze this in carefully. I highly suggest you put in these 4 boxes towards the bottom, right above strength and weaknesses, and then fill in these points. But first, above those, maybe pause the video and write down Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and West Virginia eventually. These would be our border states, and they all stay in the Union. That's a key point. This would be a group of states that would have both slave and anti-slave people fighting for it. In fact, a lot of those states had brothers and sisters that fought for the North, and then the other brother and sister would have fought or believed in the Southern view. This tore families apart, and actually people met on the battlefield against one another and shot at each other and killed one another. Sad story. But to make the story short, we need to define a border state as a slave state that borders a free state. And once again, if I'm going too fast, pause the video and get this written in at any point. Let's start with Maryland. Maryland was very close to Richmond. It was, which was the Confederate capital, Richmond, Virginia. Maryland was very important as a border state. That was probably the one that Lincoln definitely knew he could not lose. Lincoln worked tirelessly to keep the Union all together and not lose these border states. In fact, he called them the difference maker at one point. Kentucky controlled the Ohio River. Remember, rivers, like railroads, they were the lifeline of trade and movement of goods and people. Missouri controlled the Mississippi River, kind of towards the west. Very important state. Many slave people there, many anti-slave people there too. They would cause skirmishes going on in that state all the time as well. Delaware was close to Philadelphia. Philadelphia was a northern state, so therefore that's why Delaware was very important there. All right, that's just a guy. Our last point is with these border states factored in, the Union had 24 states, like I mentioned earlier on the previous slide, and the Confederacy had 11. Let's move on to the next slide. This is just to show you the progression of states that we've already made in our notes. Remember, these blue ones, they dropped out of the Union first. After the first shots were fired, we had these gray ones, and you can see the border states here in blue and the northern in red. Okay, let's talk strength and weaknesses. We have 2 boxes on your sheet here. We'll start with the Confederacy. The Confederates had better leaders such as Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, just to keep it short. They had stronger motivation. They were fighting on their home soil. Most battles were fought in the South. I'm running out of time here. They had knowledge of their land because most of the battles were fought there. They knew where all the hiding spots were, here, there, everywhere. The Union strengths now, they had a larger population, 22 million versus 9. They had superior manpower and resources. Remember, all the factories were in the north. They had more railroads, like 60 to 70% of all railroads and industry was in the north. They had a much bigger navy. Moving my picture over here. Last fact, the North had Abraham Lincoln. What an extreme benefit to have him. he was so well-rounded and well-liked by everybody, and he had the power to unify the entire country behind him in all the states. He's really the reason why the border states stayed in the Union. He had a very dramatic impact on them staying on the northern side. All right, I'm going to pause here because I got to teach my next class, but I'll be back in about an hour, but not on video, to sum up the rest of the page. Peace.